I'm Scott Cardis, an Asia Pacific analyst here with RANE, and I'm joined by Roger Baker. Hi, Roger.
Howdy, Scott.
So we're going to be talking a lot about the DPRK today, starting off with some DPRK and COVID. So the last week, it turns out the DPRK admitted they have COVID after 2 years of not.
Right.
And,
I think when we're looking at this COVID outbreak, the North Koreans have been one of the most susceptible countries to COVID. Well, I wouldn't underestimate their medical capacity for basic medical care in country. And the North Koreans, like the Cubans, have focused on doctors and things like that and basic medical care. They just don't have the I think the ability to absorb the disruption to labor and life. And that's why we've watched them be extremely cautious on COVID for the last 2 years. And only in the last 3 or 4 months have they even started cautiously opening up select borders for select trade, despite the economic hardships they've been through. And now it seems like they're kind of wall to COVID. And there's always been some assertion that some COVID has been coming through the country, but their wall has broken down undeniably. And if you watch the North Korean media, all of their attention has shifted dramatically to this and to this COVID fight. And if you think about social or health crises in North Korea, right? You go back to the famines or the food crises or things like that. They've sort of struggled through. This one is pretty unique in the way they're able to manage it or not manage it. And Scott, I know we were talking earlier about how the North Koreans view their relationships with others. Why haven't they vaccinated anybody? What are the offers for COVID treatment care coming in? What are you seeing as to the North Korean response in relation to its neighbors or other countries or the international community in offering help or assistance on this crisis?
yeah, North Korea's actually refused vaccinations. China had offered them, under the Sinovacs, or they were offering that a lot, and they refused that. They had officially claimed they were worried about the efficacy and then side effect of vaccinations, although they hinted that they would be okay with Pfizer and Moderna. But even though they said they're interested in it, when the United States and even South Korea especially has offered that unconditionally, they're like, they will give them treatment, they'll give them vaccinations, no strings attached. So just drop it off at your doorstep, Kim Jong-un. North Korea's refused it, and it seems like they are going back with Chinese treatment. Apparently, they landed a few planes in China to pick up treatment, although a few planes of medical care and medical treatment for COVID for 2 million cases now is not enough. And to what you mentioned too, for the past 2 years, North Korea has just had such a wall of COVID. There was a South Korean defector who they shot under fears of COVID. Like, he got on the beach and then they shot him. It's like, and North Korea like never turns away anyone going from south to north. It's like never happens. So that was a huge deal. Yeah, in the past 3 or 4 months, when they reopened the land bridge and the trade and the trains on the border with China, it's probably where it officially came in, at least this variant, the Omicron variant. But yeah, right now I see that North Korea is focusing heavily on at least the treatment. They're not preventing, they're not vaccinating. And I think part of that too is because they don't have the capabilities to keep the vaccinations fresh. They have to be really cold, and the North Korean medical system just doesn't have the capabilities. So even if they got the vaccinations, my understanding is they couldn't really vaccinate most of the people anyway, because there's no way to keep it cold or get the people there in time to get vaccinated.
Yeah, I'm not sure on their cold storage capability, but aside from that, and even if you had a limitation on cold storage, you would think that they would preference Pyongyang, right, and
Yeah.
start vaccinating the capital, and then move out from there to other places, and they do have the ability to mobilize the military as a tool of medical aid and things like that. Why do you think the North Koreans ultimately have been so reticent to accept any vaccines up to this point, even UN-backed vaccines, um, it, at all. I mean, it's one thing to say it's an important to be a independent nation and self-reliant nation, blah blah
Yeah,
blah,
yeah,
and there had been some hints that North Korean hackers were trying to steal vaccine data early on, anyway.
yeah.
But what is your perception of why the North Koreans simply have refused to accept this, when in the past they've accepted food aid, they've accepted health and medical aid at other times? There just seems to be such a strange aversion to it this time. But we do know that, for example, for the last 2 years, the North Koreans have recognized COVID. They're not being pretending
Yeah.
COVID doesn't exist. They're not pretending it's not a threat, even when you haven't necessarily seen masking all the time. You would always see pictures come out in North Korean media of spraying things down with disinfectant and showing that they took it seriously and
Yeah,
blah blah blah.
Kim Jong Un like having this mask and be like, "I take this seriously" and something
Yeah,
like
so
that.
what's your perception on why they just refuse vaccines? Is it fear of exploitation through the vaccines, or is it just uh, an oddity of this particular administration?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking a lot about too. And there are two options, I think. One is that even though there are no official strings attached to vaccines, North Korea may view it as, or may be worried that if they accept, let's say, South Korean vaccines, the South Korean administration in like a year can say, hey, we gave you 20 million doses of vaccine doses. Why don't you restart Kaesong? Why don't we start sitting down in negotiations? Like, even though it's not officially used as leverage, that could be a fear. The other thing is, and this is a little different, is the administration might be trying to put on a very strong front and say, we don't need the outside help. We can beat it. Our Juche ideology with the Kim family and the Kim regime, he could be saying, hey, look, we don't need this outside help. We could beat it. Look at how strong we are. China couldn't beat it on their own. Look at all the problems they're having. Look at the United States, all the problems that COVID caused domestically with them. But we stay strong and firm. That could be an option too. I am not of the opinion that North Korea is holding out for any like extra free aid. I see that opinion come around sometimes. You see it on Reddit, and I'm like, guys, no, like it makes no sense for them to do that. So I don't know what your thoughts on that too. Do you kind of agree or
Yeah, I mean,
disagree?
I wonder if there's any concern from the North that they believe that foreign supplied vaccines will contain nefarious ingredients, let's say. That
Well,
that that this could be a vector for targeting the North Korean elite, or things like that. I know that it it's odd, but because they're refusing it from China as well. They're
mm-hmm.
refusing it from the US, they refused it from everybody. Um, or some combination of these issues, this radical independence concept, plus a slight fear of manipulation via the vaccine. I mean, I'm not sure they're really worried about someone saying, "We gave you something nice, give us something back," because
Yeah,
whatever, you already gave it to us, you can't take it back, so who
yeah.
cares, right?
What are you
So
gonna
that
do? Like,
that issue is always there. Um, but yeah, it does seem a little odd that they wouldn't even take the UN-backed, internationalist vaccine program. And I wonder, though, if as we watch the spread expand, and nobody has been able to contain or constrain these current variants in the rate of spread. We see the whole Shanghai issue in China, despite all
yeah,
their years of lockdown. This is one that just gets out of containment. Zero COVID strategies have a really tough time in the face of these Delta variants, right? It
yeah.
just doesn't seem to work. So I wonder if the North Koreans may, from a pragmatic perspective, change their view on this a little bit down the road as they try to manage it, or at least if they really push for additional supplies of the retrovirals, or anything else that's used as a COVID treatment. The one advantage they have is that if this particular variant is their primary variant, While it spreads a lot, it's not as deadly as previous variants.
Yeah.
And so it may be that they think they can sort of manage that through more traditional means. We're seeing increased waves in the United States and in Europe right now. And yes, there's a slight uptick in hospitalization, but that's more a reflection of the sheer number of cases than a
Yeah.
reflection of the severity of the variant.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking too with the new they were talking about the fatality rates, mortality rates, and stuff like that. So it was like, South Korea just got over their big Omicron wave the past 3.5 weeks or so. They've been just dropping from like 500,000 cases a day down to like 80,000, but their hospitalization is really low. Now part of that's due to vaccination rates, but yeah, this is interesting to see. And I know at least South or North Korea has claimed that the recent spread has not affected their industrial output in some places, which I mean, I don't know how much we can trust that, but it is interesting to see that they are the narrative from the Kim regime is saying, hey, we are still not affected by this. Look what we could do. And
Yeah, and
and
go ahead.
I was gonna say, and I know that kind of bleeds into this other thing with Joe Biden's now in South Korea. And everyone's kind of worried and thinking about what is North Korea going to do, because we've been seeing for the past what 3 months that they've been fixing things at the Punggye missile nuclear test site. There's word that they can conduct an ICBM test. There's a spy plane that flew from Okinawa across North Korea's border and said, "Hey, we're watching your ICBM locations." So maybe we could see something like that. Part of this, like again, COVID isn't stopping us. Look at how strong we are. Do you think that's potentially playing into this?
Yeah, I mean that was in a lot of the early statements when they finally admitted the ravage of COVID and things of that sort. They were very clear in the government pronouncements that COVID prevention and mitigation activity was not supposed to undermine economic plans and economic goals. And by default, we can assume it also doesn't undermine strategic deterrence goals.
Yeah.
Um, and we had seen that as we talked about last time, initially it was still shy of the ICBMs. They've now shifted that onto the ICBM capability. I think in part triggered by just the that you have to periodically reaffirm your deterrence if you're going to keep it as a deterrence. And I don't think that the Ukraine crisis is completely insignificant to the way the North Koreans think about deterrence, and the need to demonstrate strong and capable deterrence. So now we're sitting at a moment where, quote, at any time, they could launch another ICBM, they could do a new nuclear test in the mountain. The South Koreans have a special protocol if that happens while Biden is there, and they'll immediately go in and start running the joint command and have both
Yeah.
presidents sitting next to each other to run the joint command, or it'll happen while he's in Japan or things like that. And so I think the North is trying to simultaneously showcase that they are still strong, and that might also go into their fear of accepting aid at this moment, because again, they don't want to show any weakness because they're terribly worried that the lesson of Ukraine was that if you don't have a good deterrence and you're slightly weak, somebody's going to move on you, and you can't be sure that the other nuclear powers are going to protect you from that movement. Now, I don't think the US is anywhere near ready to invade North Korea, but nonetheless, from their long-term perspective, they have to constantly show that they are strong and secure, rather than easy prey. And it may even be, everyone looks at from this side of the pond at you look at the U.S. threat to North Korea, or at least their
Yeah.
perception, but the North Koreans also perceive a potential threat from China, and
Yeah.
they
That,
do
that that's
not
something
want
everyone
to be
talks about.
dominated by China. And if they are weak, and at this moment where the U.S. is reshaping its Asia Pacific posture, North Korea may find it harder and harder to keep that independent position and find themselves dragged further and further into China's orbit. And while that benefits them economically, it reduces their sense of national independence, which they hold very, very dear.
Yeah. I actually see a good question there by Hugh James. Do you think Korea will be reunified within this century? Um, like I have a
Oh,
lot of opinions on
century,
this.
yeah.
In the century, I right now, reunification is a real weird topic, at least in South Korea. Right now, I don't think the Koreas are going to be reunified, and just because the current generation of South Koreans have almost no ties to North Korea, so they don't have a family, they don't have like a cousin or brother or sister even that they had that they were separated before the war or even shortly after. And so there's less of a driving factor to reunify because a lot of young South Koreans see, oh man, this is very going to be very expensive and it's going to cause a lot of problems. We don't really want reunification. What about just some peace? What about maybe just normalization of relations and accepting that the war is not even just a ceasefire, it just the war is over and we're done. And there's a lot of reasons why I'm pretty sure the Kim regime will never accept reunification because they're the ones who'll go away and they're the ones who will be tried in the ICCJ for crimes against humanity.
So though we've been thrown out the question in the century, in the next 5-10 years, I think the dynamics you're talking about are very strong. I think if you look at the long-term dynamics of what's happening regionally, what's happening demographically, Korea, the Korean Peninsula is the minnow between whales, right? This is where it sits. As we watch the rise and expansion of China as an outward pushing power, as you watch the resumption of Japan as the bastion of military and security dynamics in Northeast Asia and as the primary counter to China, Korea is stuck in the middle. When I think about then the strategic logic for the Koreans, there is a long-term strategic logic to rebuild Korea as a secure single entity. It's exploitable and weak when it's squeezed between those two big powers and it's divided. And the history of Korea, you go back to the Silla and the Goguryeo and all of that, and you can see the exploitation of big outside powers, particularly the Chinese, of divisions inside the Korean Peninsula. And then the divisions utilize that, but then get subsumed by that, and it creates all sorts of chaos and problems, right? Secondarily, if you think about it, right, in North Korea, you have most of the first generation leaders are dead. The ones who were
under Kim
the
Il-sung,
ones who were the true revolutionaries, their claim to power. The second generation, all of Kim Jong-il's era, a lot of those are still there. And those are the people, I would argue, who can't afford reunification or normalization of North Korea, right? Because in the way the modern system works, they're all up for links to terrorism or things like that, and they all get thrown in jail, and they don't have a future. The third generation, Kim Jong-un and his cadre, they all studied abroad. They haven't been engaged in terrorism. They've been engaged in violating UN sanctions and blah blah blah, but they haven't been doing the old, raids on South Korea. Yeah, they killed his brother and all little things like that. But
they shelled Yongpyeong-do, but like that's
whatever, one or two people. But it's not the blowing up airliners. It's not the stuff that we saw in the 80s and 90s. And I think that as you remove that second generation and you weaken and they start dying off, there is more incentive for that third generation to find ways to remain influential and powerful, but not necessarily only within a weak space. So there are long-term dynamics that are pushing the Koreans together, even as the short-term social and political dynamics make that in the near term something very unlikely to happen. And I know another question popped up here while we were there, something about who's North Korea's next target. I guess to me, the question is, how would we define target? If we think militarily, I would argue that the North Koreans are primarily, they fully recognize they're primarily a defensive power.
They're not about to wage any offensive
for them to bomb South Korea and try to take over. They're primarily a defensive power. That said, economically, if you think in the cyberspace realm, they're out to exploit anybody they can because they need any ways that they can get currency. And COVID has been a huge hit on their traditional manual ways to move money around and to
Mhm.
make money for the economy, and emphasize that cyberspace and that cyber targeting for action activity. And I think within that, while they primarily focus on economic activity, they certainly are looking at ways to utilize the cyber domain to bolster their national security by finding backdoors and finding ways to disrupt U.S., South Korean, Japanese military and economic capability down the road.
I mean, in kind of piggybacking off that cyber thing, and I'll get to the Kojiri comment in a second, is North Korea's shifted to cyberspace to fund a lot of their activities. That Axie Online hack for $650 million in crypto. Cryptocurrency is a boon for them for new ways to get money. It's because these crypto exchanges, you see a lot of them. There's a lot of speculation, pump and dump. A lot of people have very poor security on their crypto accounts. So I think that's, in a way, it's almost it's given them the impetus to be like, oh well, we could have our traditional money making ways, but we can also just shift over here and get more money potentially for less risk in cyberspace and less cost. And yeah, we got the Kojuri comment. Why do you think North Korea stopped incursions into South Korea? Too risky for not enough benefit? Yeah, part of it was that. I think a lot of it was the development of South Korea back through probably the 80s to 90s, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the lack of support from traditional partners. Those also played a part because it wasn't really up until like the 80s or 90s that North Korea was technically poorer than South Korea, if I'm remembering my development correctly. So
Yeah, so I lived in Korea during the last year of major infiltrations, and that was in the 90s. Um, and if you really look, it's the post Cold War that starts changing things. If Kim Il Sung had not had a myocardial infarction, um, we wouldn't be in the current situation we are. I think that the North Koreans would have stuck to the '94 deal in a very different way, and we probably would have seen maybe not full unification by now, but we would have seen a much stronger accommodation because Kim Il Sung could do that. He had he had the credentials to do that. Kim
yeah,
Jong Il couldn't do anything. He really had to struggle to ensure that he was in charge and respected and things like that. He basically sealed off the country for 3+ years after signing the '94 agreement,
hmm
just to make sure that he was secure, even though everybody knew he was going to take over for years. And so I think that dynamic is largely what led to the infiltrations. Yeah, they really weren't worth it. The North Koreans were shifting focus on a different deterrent type. I think they recognized that they weren't going to overthrow the South. You also
yeah,
get the evolution of the South Korean leadership. So by '97, Kim Dae-jung comes in. The military regimes and the post-military regimes are done. You've completely shifted what South Korea is, and the infiltration, assassination attempts, and things like that just didn't seem to be as viable. They even slowed down and pretty much eventually stopped the snagging of Japanese off the beaches or
yeah.
anything like that too, and shifted to other tools and tactics for managing things.
Yeah. And I see the other thing. Do you think the Kim regime will view Biden as a weak
No,
leader?
no.
Uh,
Eh,
yeah, yeah.
I,
Go for
I
it,
know
Roger. I know you got this.
everybody politically wants to be like. This is a politically loaded question. No offense to our questioner, but it's clearly a politically loaded question. It's not about Biden. It's about the size and focus and scope of the United States military and the U.S. South Korean military alliance. Quite frankly, the North Koreans were pretty shocked at how the Trump administration basically tried to cut off defense ties with South Korea, and actually looked at the ideas of pulling out of South Korea, and really hindered the cooperative military relationship there. And lots of people in the U.S. were pretty shocked with that, as were a lot of the conservatives in the South Korean side. So I think it's not about what's the president like. If they thought the president was weak, they would have exploited that the moment he came in. They could have gotten all sorts of deals out of him. They haven't
Yeah.
been trying to get deals out of the U.S. They've actually been ignoring calls for talks with the United States, and I don't think that they see that they're going to be able to get freebies and stuff out of this administration ways others are. They are, though, looking at an evolution in the United States of the way the US looks at North Korea as a nuclear power, right? And while the
Yeah.
US's stated position remains the denuclearization of North Korea, and they'll use the North Korean term
Yeah.
of the Korean Peninsula, um, the reality is that I think there's a shift going on in the United States to look at arms control as an intermediate step and recognizing that you're not just going to get the North Koreans to give it up. And if you want to manage the North Korean dynamic, then you have to do it well, even if you don't accept or recognize, you have to understand the reality that they have nuclear weapons. They're not going away. So how do you engage while keeping that nuclear threat lower, rather than simply say all or nothing, right? Which is totally ineffective policy that, quite frankly, has been tried by most administrations.
And I have the opinion that this concept of we have to denuclearize North Korea, it's this constant rhetoric. I think it's almost we've painted ourselves into a corner in a way, because the moment the politicians start saying, well, maybe we should accept North Korea as a nuclear power, that's kind of political suicide in some ways. But we have to accept that fact. We have to accept the reality that the DPRK is a nuclear power, and they're not intending to use it offensively. As we mentioned, it's entirely defensive. They don't want to attack LA. They just want to, keep people from regime change. So we see publicly available proof of North Korean cyber power. The biggest thing I say is the Lazarus Group. They're a North Korean, well, at least suspected North Korean hacking group. They operate. They conducted several cyber attacks. They were behind the Axie Online hack, Axie Online's a kind of an MMO game that you can earn cryptocurrency in the game, and they hacked that for like $650 million. And it was only after about a month that everyone kind of admitted, yeah, A, the hack happened, B, it was the Lazarus Group, and C, it was North Korea. So they were able to, that's a lot of money in cryptocurrency. So that's probably one of the best things I can say about that is just the Lazarus Group. If you see him in the news, that's a big North Korean cyber threat.
Yeah, and there's an interesting other dynamic when you think about what the North Koreans are doing in the cyberspace. They're also, quite frankly, renting out well-trained computer folks for perfectly legitimate purposes all over the world, just the same way they used to do animators, and things like that, because it's relatively cost effective. They can either place them in China or route all of their activity via China or Russia. And they utilize that. So in North Korea, they've done a lot of work over the last 20, 30 years to train up very computer literate folks and then try to get them, quite frankly, legitimate work, just as much as they try to take the really specialist ones and push them into the illegitimate space for hacking and things of that sort. And this is, and it's sort of a dirty secret that no one wants to ever admit, but it's been a long time that people have been utilizing North Korean technical skills and technical labor, and simply chalking it up to being Chinese or Romanian or even calling it South Korean.
Yeah, because
labor.
The FBI just said that they're like, oh, by the way, your IT expert who never turns the webcam on, only gets paid in like cryptocurrency, might actually be North Korean. They just said that. It was all over Reuters, I think yesterday or the day before. Sorry, days are blurring together for me. So we have that. Yeah, that's more, more activity. And like you said, it's been going on for a while now, but I think now people are kind of quiet, at least admitting it. So
yeah, and they're a country that, from their perspective, they're a legitimate country, and they have to be able to earn currency somehow. I mean, if they're going to earn currency by helping to, I don't know, program websites, maybe that's better than earning currency by selling tactical ballistic missiles to other countries.
Like Egypt or someone, whoever wants to buy. Yeah, will we see an increase in gray zone tactics by North Korea post-Russian invasion of Ukraine? It's kind of an interesting thought.
Again, I think that lots of countries are looking at Ukraine and saying, unless you are guaranteed under the nuclear umbrella of another big power, you are not protected from another big power.
Well, but even so, Ukraine weren't they also supposed to be protected by the US, the UK?
They were not under the US nuclear umbrella. There was no treaty obligation for that. They were not in NATO, and that was the point, that they were outside of it, right? Yeah. There's only a few countries that are inside that perceived nuclear umbrella. When you go nuclear power to nuclear power, there's a lot of caution on what you're going to do and who's willing to come in. The Chinese sort of have an agreement with the North Koreans. I don't think the North Koreans buy it and fully believe it.
Yeah.
I don't think the North Koreans believe that the Chinese would nuke LA if the US invaded Pyongyang.
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily see China as a deterrent to U.S. action in North Korea. Again, I don't think the U.S. is about to invade North Korea, but the North Koreans have to consider that fear. So gray area activity. I guess the question to me is toward what end? Yes, I do believe that they're going to increase their activity to be able to find vulnerabilities and weaknesses, particularly as the South and the U.S. are adding in more missile defense capability, more radar capability, all of these things that there's a back and forth in any defensive offensive security posture where one side develops something, the next side develops the counter, the next side develops the counter to the counter, the counter to the counter.
And you're always trying to find new exploitations. It's rock, paper, scissors.
Right. And so the gray area gives you a lower cost way of doing the counters. And if you do it effectively, you only show a tiny bit of your hand about capability, and that creates a certain sense of uncertainty by the opponents as well. You have to show some, right? You can't, if you don't tell anybody about the Doomsday device, it doesn't serve its purpose, right? As we learned in Doctor Strangelove. But but you also don't need to show everything. You need to create that sense of uncertainty and doubt that plays a certain role, particularly in the gray area. And then the final, I think, information ops. The North Koreans have been super clunky in that, right? They make the Chinese look finessed. Certainly, the Russians are at the pinnacle of effective information ops internationally. I think we can probably think about the North Koreans continuing to try to expand that if they can.
And I think this will be our last question here. Doesn't that mean that the appropriate action towards North Korea would be hedging and not isolation?
I don't do policy prescription, but I do think that if you look historically, the idea of simply isolating a country into capitulation really has not shown success.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. I mean, some people would argue, okay, maybe South Korea was shunned into change, or South Africa, sorry, was shunned into change at some point. And maybe, but I think that these countries that are sitting there, I'm not sure that isolation is an effective policy if what you're really trying to do is ease the sense of constant tension. I mean, if the US is truly focused on China as the primary competitor within the region, North Korea is a distraction, and you want to find ways to reduce that distraction so that you can focus your efforts on your main competitor, your main opponent, your main enemy.
And the more isolated someone is, the more threatened they can actually feel. Because if you shun someone off in the corner, in theory, they could feel really worried about potentially being next if they're so isolated from everyone in the world.
And so I'm guessing that that's part of the discussion tomorrow between Yoon and Biden.
Well,
Certainly,
yeah.
North Korea is going to be on the agenda, but I know we're pushing time here. But the other things I'd really keep an eye on is economic and where South Korea can ingratiate itself into U.S. strategic interests. So the South Koreans are real cautious and reticent on the whole military dynamic push against China. They're really worried about the U.S. overexpanding Japan's developing military and military role in the region. But they have a strategic advantage in things, and I think there was no coincidence. The first place they took Biden was the semiconductor facility. They have ways to play into U.S. gaps and vulnerabilities and strategic interests that don't necessarily always wrap around, okay, we're going to build more of X to fight the Chinese or to block the Chinese. And I think those are things to be really keeping an eye on. There's some talk about some potential cooperation in nuclear energy development between the two. I'd look to see if that's focused on either international construction of nuclear power plants, or really interestingly would be if this is talking about the modular microscale nuclear reactors.
Yeah, I know nuclear power is a big hot topic now, especially as countries are transitioning away from coal. So and well, fossil fuels in general and nuclear power in the South Korean Peninsula is a hot topic. Japan, obviously after Fukushima, is a big deal, but that's a whole conversation for another day. So
Yeah,
I'd
I
like
think
to
we could
thank,
go on for a while, but
yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your questions. I'm Scott Cardish, Asia Pacific analyst. Roger Baker, Senior VP of Strategic Analysis. Did I get that title right?
sure, why not?
Okay, and there'll be a link above or below. You guys can check us out for on RANE and check out more of our content.